I remember the moment I decided. The old fool had grown soft. Every year, I watched him from the shadows, his figure stooped under the weight of his endless generosity. He visited their homes with his sack of trinkets, his face lit with a joy that seemed almost foolish. And yet, they took and took without a second thought, children ripping through wrapping paper, their laughter masking the mounting piles of discarded toys. I watched as the list of demands grew longer each year. Letters filled with requests for newer, shinier things. There were no thanks, no appreciation, only the insatiable hunger of entitlement. And still, he kept going. Kept delivering. But it wasn't just them. He had changed too. His laugh no longer boomed the way it once did. His steps dragged as if the snow itself sought to hold him back. The fire in his eyes had dimmed, replaced by something softer, weaker. I saw it most clearly the year he left a wooden horse for a boy who wanted a bicycle. The child had kicked it aside in disgust, and still the old man had smiled, as if his purpose could endure such disdain. That night, I watched him return to his sleigh, shoulders slumped, his hands trembling as they gripped the reins. He looked back at the workshop once, his eyes brimming with exhaustion. Something in me twisted. Not with pity, but with frustration. How could he let himself wither for their sake? Why did he keep giving to a world that had forgotten how to give back? It was then I knew. He was no longer fit to lead. The burden he had carried for centuries was no longer his to bear. And so, when the storm came that winter, howling through the peaks and battering the sleigh, I waited. And when he faltered, his strength giving way beneath the weight of his coat and his years, I stepped forward. It wasn't just a choice. It was a necessity. Year after year, he hauled that sack of toys across the world, feeding their greed, their endless hunger for more. I'd seen it in their eyes, the glint of expectation, the sneer of entitlement. It disgusted me. They never questioned where the gifts came from, never thought about the cost. The snowstorm was raging that night, wind howling through the frozen peaks of the north. I waited at the edge of the workshop, watching as his sleigh came in for its final landing of the season. He was bent low over the reins, his shoulders slumped under the weight of centuries. When he finally climbed down, his boots crunching against the ice, I saw how slow his movements had become, how pale his face looked against the red of his coat. So when his time came, and he fell weary in his sleigh, I stood over him as the snow fell, the northern winds screaming in our ears. His hands trembled as he passed me the reins, his red coat heavy with frost. His eyes, so tired, so filled with hope, met mine one last time. "Don't let it end," he whispered. His voice cracked, barely audible over the gale. But his words lingered in my mind, twisting and gnawing at my resolve. How could he believe I would preserve his legacy? His vision of a world filled with joy and light was so at odds with my nature. Yet, as I stared into his tired, pleading eyes, I felt something unfamiliar, a flicker of doubt. Could I truly carry this burden, knowing my path would lead to something darker, something harsher? Could I uphold his promise, even as I reshaped it into my own? He thought he'd handed Christmas to a savior. But I was no savior. My claws curled tightly around the reins, the leather creaking under the pressure. As the storm howled around us, I questioned whether I was even capable of fulfilling the task in any form. His smile haunted me, as if some part of him believed I could be better than what I had always been. It was maddening. I had no interest in their smiles, their joy. Or did I? He was wrong. The reindeer didn't trust me at first. They snorted and stamped their hooves, their eyes wide with fear as I approached the sleigh. I didn't blame them. They had only known kindness, a guiding hand wrapped in red velvet. But kindness wouldn't carry them through what was coming. My claws scraped across the wood as I grasped the sleigh's edge. The sound cut through the cold like a blade. They shied away, except for one. The black stag. It stepped forward, its antlers casting jagged shadows against the snow, steam rising from its nostrils. Its eyes burned like embers as it lowered its head to me. "Good," I muttered, my voice a growl. "You'll do." I grabbed the reins, my claws slicing thin lines into the leather, and climbed aboard. The sleigh creaked under my weight, but it held. My sack, his sack for now, felt foreign on my shoulder. Too soft. Too full of things I would never give. Fly, I commanded, snapping the reins. The reindeer hesitated, their ears twitching. The black stag let out a low, guttural snarl, its breath steaming in the frigid air. One by one they obeyed, their hooves kicking up snow as they surged forward. The sleigh jerked, and the icy wind bit into my face as we rose into the night. The stars above seemed to mock me, their cold light unblinking. I ignored them. My eyes were fixed on the horizon, where the first house waited. The house appeared below, its lights twinkling like false stars. It stood alone in a sea of snow, its windows glowing warm and golden. The sound of laughter floated up to me, faint but grating. I landed with a thud, my hooves crunching into the snow. The sleigh's sack felt different on my shoulder, heavier, but not with toys. With purpose. Sliding down the chimney, I felt the soot cling to my skin, a comforting reminder of the darkness I carried with me. The hearth below was cold, the ashes of an earlier fire barely glowing. I stepped out into the room, my hooves silent on the worn rug. The warmth of the house was suffocating. The air was thick with the scent of pine and cinnamon, too sweet, too cloying. The family sat together, their laughter and chatter blending into an irritating hum. Gifts were piled high around the tree, gaudy and wasteful. I stepped closer, the bells on my coat jingling softly. It felt wrong, this coat. The red fabric was a mockery of my purpose. But I had made a promise. The stockings hung by the fire, stuffed with treats and trinkets. I reached out, claws slicing them open with ease. Candy spilled onto the floor, a sticky, colorful mess. From my sack, I pulled new offerings. Black bundles tied with frayed string, their contents shifting as I pushed them into place. They would learn soon enough what lay inside. "Who are you?" The voice cut through the stillness, soft but piercing in its simplicity. I turned slowly, the bells on my coat jingling faintly. The child stood in the doorway, their frames small and shrouded in the shadows cast by the flickering fire. They clutched a worn blanket, its edges frayed from years of use. Their eyes, wide and unblinking, reflected both curiosity and a faint shimmer of fear. Their gaze darted to the spilled candy on the floor, the torn stockings, and finally to the black bundles I had placed by the hearth. I could see the thoughts swirling behind their young eyes, trying to make sense of the scene. My claws twitched involuntarily as I observed them, a strange pang coursing through me, something close to regret, but not quite. "Are you Santa's helper?" the child asked hesitantly, taking a small step forward. My lips curled into a faint, humorless smile. "Not quite," I said, my voice a low rumble. "Santa needed rest. I'm taking his place for now." The child tilted their head, studying me with an intensity that was unsettling. "Why do you look so scary?" they asked, their voice trembling but still steady enough to carry the question. "Scary?" I echoed, crouching down so we were at eye level. My horns cast long, jagged shadows on the walls, and the firelight danced across my darkened face. "Maybe it's because I'm not here to bring you what you want. I'm here to give you what you need." Their small hands clutched the blanket tighter. "What do I need?" they whispered, their curiosity momentarily outweighing their fear. I reached into my sack, my claws brushing against the cold, hard edges of the gift I had prepared for them. I pulled out a small box, its surface etched with runes that seemed to shift and writhe under the firelight. The air grew heavy as I held it out to them. "Take it," I said. "A gift for you. But be warned, what you find inside is not for the faint of heart." Their hand trembled as they reached for the box. The moment their fingers touched its surface, a faint hum filled the room, and the runes began to glow softly. The child's breath hitched, their eyes widening as the box seemed to respond to their touch. I could see their reflection in its polished surface, their face a mixture of awe and trepidation. "What's inside?" they asked, their voice barely audible. "That," I said, rising to my full height, "is for you to discover. But remember, the lesson it holds is one you must carry with you." The child clutched the box to their chest, their gaze flicking back up to me. Will Santa come back? They asked, their voice small but steady. I hesitated, my claws brushing the edge of the mantel as I turned toward the chimney. Only if you're very, very good, I said, my tone heavy with meaning. The child didn't move as I disappeared back up the chimney. I glanced down from the roof one last time, seeing their silhouette framed in the firelight, the box clutched tightly in their hands. For a moment, something stirred within me, a fleeting sense of hope, or perhaps satisfaction. Then the black stag bellowed, pulling me back to the task at hand. There were many more houses to visit, and many more lessons to deliver. Was small, trembling. I turned slowly. A child stood in the doorway, clutching a blanket, their wide eyes reflecting the firelight. My claws twitched. Children had always been my domain, my responsibility. But this one, they stared at me, not with fear, but with curiosity. I'm here to deliver Christmas, I said, my voice low and rough. The words tasted strange. Where's Santa? They asked, stepping closer. I crouched, bringing myself to their level. Santa needed rest. I'm taking his place for now. Their gaze flicked to the sack, to the torn stockings. You're different. Different doesn't mean worse, I replied, though I wasn't sure I believed it. From the sack, I pulled a small box, its surface etched with shifting runes. I held it out. Here. A gift. They hesitated, then reached out. As their fingers touched the box, it pulsed, a faint hum filling the air. Their eyes widened. What is it? Something to remind you, I said, standing. Of the cost of greed. I left them staring at the box as I climbed back up the chimney. Outside, the air was sharper, colder. The reindeer pawed at the ground, restless. The black stag bellowed, steam rising from its nostrils. I climbed into the sleigh, snapping the reins. We rose into the night, the wind howling around us. House after house, I left my mark. Each home was different, but they shared the same hollow warmth that sickened me. At one house, the laughter was particularly loud, echoing through the frosted windows as I approached. Inside, a young boy tore through wrapping paper with a frenzy, tossing aside each gift in search of something better. His parents exchanged forced smiles, their exhaustion evident in the dark circles under their eyes. I stepped into their living room unnoticed, my hooves muffled by the plush carpet. The boy froze as I placed a single black bundle on the table beside the tree. His head tilted, curiosity flickering in his eyes as he reached for it. When he unwrapped it, his face fell. It was a mirror, old and tarnished, with runes etched into the glass. As he stared into it, the runes began to glow, showing him scenes of his own tantrums, his selfish demands. Tears welled in his eyes as he watched himself, and the parents stood silently, their expressions unreadable. At another house, the family was gathered around the fire, the parents distracted as their teenage daughter scrolled through her phone. Her face twisted with disdain as she muttered something under her breath, ignoring the gifts piled at her feet. I left her a small wooden box, its surface scorched as if pulled from a fire. When she opened it, black smoke curled into the room, forming scenes of forgotten moments, times when her parents had sacrificed for her, their silent struggles to give her more than they ever had. Her phone clattered to the floor, forgotten as she stared into the smoke, her expression slowly softening. The gifts I gave were not the kind they wanted, but the kind they needed. Fear, humility, the weight of consequence, these were my offerings. And in every home I left, the warmth grew colder, but the air grew sharper with understanding. The world had forgotten the old ways, the hard ways. It was time they remembered. Fear, humility, the weight of consequence, these were my offerings. The world had forgotten the old ways, the hard ways. It was time they remembered. By dawn, the sack was empty, and the sleigh creaked under the strain of what we had done. The reindeer were exhausted, their breath labored. As we touched down on the mountain, I looked back at the world below. The lights of their homes flickered like dying embers. I sat in the sleigh, my claws resting on the reins. For the first time in centuries, I felt something close to satisfaction. The old man had his way, and I had mine. They would learn. They would change. And maybe, just maybe, Christmas would survive. But not without me.